We're back on the Spitfire. Got some bits and pieces for the carbs and we're starting to put that back together. Let's get going. So we got the basic carburetor bodies back on the manifold where they belong. What I ended up doing was we put, stripped them down, cleaned them up a little bit. Got some new gaskets on the choke boxes here. Took the float bowls off, checked all of the heights of the floats, and made some minor adjustments there because they weren't all exactly the same. Got some new gaskets there because those were actually starting to crumble. And we got it back on there and got them to where they're all working, you know, and I got them set to a base adjustment right now for idle. But we did find out that this wasn't actually adjusted properly. It won't go back together. So the length of this is going to have to be adjusted once I figure out the idle speed and get these things running right. So now these are non-adjustable jets down in these carburetors here. They're pressed in, but they can be moved a little bit if you really want to. I adjust, since we're going ahead and not doing these things the way we were talking about in the last video, which I'll show you in a minute. What I ended up doing was checking the depth of all of these. These two were almost exactly the same, but this one was about 15 thousandths, 20 thousandths lower. So we got that up a little bit higher to where it's within a couple thousandths of these two, so that they're all exactly the same now. Now we can go over and look at the pistons and show you what we're doing there. So instead of messing around with the non-adjustable needles in the two carbs and adjustable in the other, what we ended up deciding to do is I had other carbs laying around that we've taken pistons out of two of them that have the adjustable needles in them. But then that left us not having three needles that were the same. So since the needle in the front carb was actually a nearly brand new needle, I got two matching new needles to put in the other two carbs. So now when we put this thing back together, they all have the same needles in all carbs and the same way of adjusting them, which makes it a whole lot easier to deal with the car from here moving forward. The owners decided that's the way he wanted to go because he wanted to kind of future-proof it so that it wouldn't be such a pain. So sorry about the sound quality in the first little bit of this video. We broke our microphone and didn't know it until we reviewed that footage. And it took us a little longer to get the bits and pieces we need to fix everything than we anticipated, I think due to the beautiful Ohio weather we're getting right now. But we got sound again, yay. Any rate, got the carbs all back together, got the tops of the carbs on it and the pistons all in, everything. And I started trying to get them set up and tune it. I got to fire up and run and got it to idle, but I was having to do more adjustments to the carbs than I figured I would and didn't get it running exactly as good as I wanted it to. So we decided I need to start looking at some of the other tune-up stuff. Because we do know we did find in the paperwork that somebody had adjusted the valves on this thing. The previous owner had taken it to a shop that was supposed to be a dyno shop, and they adjusted all the valves to the factory 10 thousandths gap. But this is a Kent cam. It doesn't want to be at 10 thousandths. You want 14 thousandths on the intake and 16 on the exhaust. So that could bleed off compression and cause lots of issues. So we did the compression check on it and found that the lowest cylinder was number 2 at 133 pounds, where the highest cylinder was number 5 at 161, giving us more than a 14% difference in compression, which is not what we want to see. You want it to stay within 10%, and this is a fairly fresh engine, so we really don't want to see that wide a variance. Readjusted all the valves to the specs for the cam, and without running it, the compression numbers went from those to number 1 being the lowest at 147, and number 6 being the highest at 163, which is only about 9% variance. A lot more acceptable. And then once we run it, it might get better, we'll see. Now, that is how you burn valves, kids, right there. If you got them set way too tight and they're holding the valves open, bleeding off compression, not only do they not run right, but the valves themselves, if they're not seating properly on the seat, will never transfer the heat out of the valve to the seat, and the valve will overheat. And then it can start transferring metal between the seat and the valve, and eventually burn a valve, and then you're pulling the cylinder head and doing a valve job and putting valves in it. Now, I don't think this has gotten that far. We'll just have to wait and see how well it tunes once I get the electrical stuff all figured out and get back to tuning on it. And then we'll monitor it over time and see what we have. Also, as part of that, I want to put a set of fresh plugs in it, because with the front 2 cylinders having lower compression and that carburetor running the richest, you know, I just want to put plugs in it before I try tuning it. Plus, it had auto lights in it. And if you've been around my channel for any length of time, you know I don't like auto lights. Actually, I don't know any real mechanics who do. So we're going to throw these in the trash and put some decent plugs in it before we go any further on that. But meanwhile, since I didn't have a microphone to work with, I started working on some of the electrical problems in this car. This car has had some reoccurring electrical problems. We found this thing has like 3 inches of paperwork that came with it. And we found 2 different receipts where the previous owner had electrical problems chased down on this car for horn not working, turn signals, running lights, and 4-way flashers. And he spent like $2,000 on this thing chasing electrical problems. And then when the new owner picked it up, he had no taillights, no turn signals, no brake lights, and the horn was working, and then it stopped working. And then he played with it, got the turn signals working, but then lost 4-way flashers, and things haven't been working right. So I've been starting to chase that down. And I first thought maybe we had a ground problem. I found a pretty rusty connector here that was for the ground at the horns up in the front of the car. Replaced that, because you know, ground's where you always start, especially with horns. And since the rack here, this was the ground on the rack, and we got more problems here, but this was all loose. So I hooked up temporary grounds from here to the frame just to get rid of that. And because these things here, ground problems through the steering column, is one of the #1 problems for horns not working, because it's got a jumper wire across the U-joint here, and then it has to ground from there down to there. And if any of those aren't grounding well, your horn's not going to work. Well, it turns out it wasn't a ground problem. After chasing a little bit and testing a few things, the wire here, the power wire coming into the relay here, was dropping power. So once you hit the horn, it would just drop off. You'd have voltage until you hook, which means you got a bad connection somewhere, broken wire, something like that, where it's getting enough connection to get voltage, but it won't carry the amperage to actually make the horns go. And after playing with that a little bit, I thought I had kind of figured out a couple different ways, but it just wasn't inconsistent. And then as I got that playing with that, then the turn signals would work and then wouldn't work. So I ended up chasing back to the fuse box here, which is kind of a common issue on these cars to have connection problems. But apparently this wire here is broken right inside of here. The previous owner, when he restored it, did not put a new wiring harness in it or a new fuse box. So I connected up to this and was checking continuity or resistance, or whichever you want to say it, on this wire. And as I moved it, the resistance reading was changing, which tells me there's some broken wires inside of here. Because I could play with this, clean it, then the horns would work. I could touch it and then it'd stop working. I could move it around, it would work and not work, work and not work. So yeah. And unfortunately, you can't seem to buy these actual connectors anywhere separately from buying a whole new fuse box. I've even checked on all the Triumph forums and no one has been able to actually find these that I can find out without buying a fuse box. So we got a new fuse box on the way, and that should finally fix that reoccurring problem. But then of course, unfortunately, in order to work on this, you got to take the brake or clutch master cylinder out of the way, and luckily for us, this one has the braided hose, which makes it really easy just to push it aside and work on this. Now, unfortunately, on these, the wiring harness runs through the fuse box here, which means if you want to replace the fuse box, you got to pull the wiring through somewhere. And this is just me speculating, but I'm guessing that the reason why you can't find these is probably the exact versions of these aren't available anymore. And what is available, they've redesigned the back of the fuse box to accept what's available now. I'll find out when I get the fuse box, because I've never actually replaced one of these fuse boxes before. But, and the other thing is the grommet that goes in here. This could use a new grommet. The grommet apparently doesn't come with the fuse box, and I can't find anyone who actually lists the grommet under Spitfire. Now they say it's available from Rimmer Brothers and some other places, but I can't find it actually listed for the Spitfire anywhere. But I did find a grommet that I can use there, but it took a little bit of digging to find something. It won't be the exact same grommet, but it'll work. So since we were actually chasing four-way flasher and turn signal issues, you always start with the hazard warning switch, because all the power runs through the switch before it even goes to the turn signals. That's usually where the problems are at. Now, of course, now that we found the problems in the fuse box, that might actually be where the problem was, but I didn't find that until I'd already was chasing in here and looking at all this stuff. But in order to get this out on this year range Spitfires, you got to take both gauges out in order to get in here to release this to get it out. But that's fine, because they had the tack on this side and the speedometer on this side, which is not where they're supposed to be. And the owner wanted me to switch them, put them in the right holes anyway. So that works out fine. Now, one of the things he wanted to do while we were in here too, was he wanted to swap from the turn signal from here in the dash into here like the GT6 originally had, because it's easier to see it here right in front of you than it is there. And he didn't like having that not working, and he's going to cover that over with something. But this is the Spitfire one, the socket, but the socket for the GT6 looked more like this one. So I got this out of my stockpile of parts up there, and we can put that, we can swap the sockets to make that work in here. And they had speakers and stuff up in here on both sides that were aftermarket, that was in the way to get up in here and look at any of that wiring up in here before I took the fuse box out. So I got all those out of the way on both sides, partly because that gives me access to adjust the windshield to try to get it squared back up to the hard top and make everything line up a little bit better. And we're going to put his radio back in. He took it out and had it converted to all like new style with I think Bluetooth and everything put into the old casing. So he still has the front of just an AM radio, but it has AM, FM, Bluetooth and all that on it. Yeah. And also having all this apart gives me the chance to run the line through the dash to be able to put the squirters together, because none of that line's run through there to go to the bottle that isn't currently mounted and that we're going to be mounting. So we're taking care of a lot of little bits and pieces here and there, and we're gonna check off that list of all the little things that irritates them or that needs fixed on this car. So now on to the steering rack. We thought it was going to be a simple issue of just tightening this down, locking it, getting the slop out of it and being done with it. Unfortunately, that's not going to be the case in here. This is the quick rack, or the high ratio rack, depending on where you're looking at it. So it's only like 2.6, 2.8 turns, something like that, lock to lock, instead of the 3.5 I think the factory rack would have been. But they don't come with any way of grounding them. Without the ground wire, the horn doesn't work. And the previous owner apparently came up with this idea of putting this on here underneath of the nut here. Well, then that pulled the plunger up further out of the rack, which means it's not putting the tension down on the rack to take the slop out. And I think there's supposed to be a spring in there as well, and there was no spring in there. I haven't taken one of these racks apart, but there's usually a spring under on pretty much every rack I've ever worked on. But by pulling that up, that went less thread engagement here into the housing, and the threads were already half pulled out of it when we got to it. And it just will not tighten down any reasonable amount to be able for it to actually stay and not come loose again. So the owner has decided to go ahead and put a replacement stock rack back in it, because he said, well, the steering gets a lot heavier when you put this rack in. That's one of the biggest complaints about this rack. And with this being the 6-cylinder instead of the 4-cylinder, a lot more weight up here, it does make the steering effort quite a bit more at, say, parking lot speeds, pulling in and out of the garage. And his wife enjoys driving this car as well, and she's rather petite and has a bit of difficulty trying to steer this thing and get it in and out of the garage. So he decided to go with the other rack to help the steering effort some. And one other thing we're going to do too is, since this thing came from Southern California, the previous owner only had water. That's what was in the radiator. There was just ever so tiny trace of antifreeze in there, and I think that was just from somebody, possibly even the current owner, just taking the cap off, going, oh, these topped off, and putting a splash of antifreeze in it. So we're going to put antifreeze in it so that it doesn't freeze up in Ohio winters and cause even more problems.